Welcome to History of the Ancient Near East. I'm your instructor, Justin Singleton. Still in the early Bronze Age, we move from early Egypt into the first of three Egyptian kingdoms, the Old Kingdom. As we discuss the Egyptian Old Kingdom, we'll be discussing what to do with the Third Dynasty. We're also going to be discussing the Old Kingdom monumental buildings, the pyramids, and other Old Kingdom innovations. Finally, we will discuss the fall of this Old Kingdom and the move into the first intermediate period of Egyptian history. Although not the oldest kingdom in Egypt, the period of time after the early dynastic period is termed the Old Kingdom, as Egyptian history is broken into three major phases: the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. The three-kingdom periodization of Egyptian history originated in 1845 by a German archaeologist by the name of C.C.J. Bunsen. And since then, the periodization has gone through major revisions. Today, each of the phases has changed, and additional phases have been added, specifically intermediate periods of instability, earlier phases, and, of course, later phases such as the late Hellenistic and Roman periods. Now, the Old Kingdom dates to around 2649 to 2130 BC, and quite a few concepts and practices developed into what would eventually become characteristic of Egypt and the pharaonic histories. And it can be said that it wasn't really until the Old Kingdom that Egypt truly became the Egypt that we know today. At this time, the roles of the kings appear to reinforce the cosmic order within the preordained world by linking the ruling king to divine beings and royal ancestors, legitimizing the king's right to rule through a history of his royal deeds. Many of these deeds seem to focus on the exploitation of resources, including copper, and the movement of luxury goods, items that both maintained and improved the prestige of Egyptian rulers. Also during this period, the position of vizier was created, an official second only to the king, a title which will continue throughout Egypt's history. Now, not much is known of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, as the historical records are somewhat scarce, writing spreading beyond the royal court only during this period, and much of the papyri used having disintegrated long ago. Thus, architecture exists as the main historical narrative. Later writings of these early years are marred with repetitions and reign lengths that appear abnormally long, and therefore add to the confusion. Now, the Old Kingdom is a period of pyramid construction, and the Third Dynasty is traditionally placed into the Old Kingdom of Egypt rather than the early dynastic because of these similarities in monumental building projects. Specifically, during the Third Dynasty was the construction of the very first pyramid, the stepped pyramid of Djoser. Now, with that said, some believe that the building of the stepped pyramid, as well as differing cultural practices, to be more in line with early dynastic Egypt rather than the Old Kingdom, and thus beginning the Old Kingdom with the Fourth Dynasty. Still, the Third Dynasty would appear to be key to the transition between older ways and what would become standard Egyptian practices. For example, the capital of the kingdom was once again moved to Memphis, whereas the Second Dynasty appears to have ruled from Thinis, a city cited by Manetho but not yet discovered. And from Memphis, this capital continued throughout the remainder of the Old Kingdom. During the Third Dynasty, independent states within the Egyptian kingdom were pulled under centralized rule from Memphis as nomes, or districts, a concept that continued in Egypt until the Muslim conquest. Now, while high officials in Egypt during the Third Dynasty, we're talking other than the king, continued the previous tradition of mud brick mastabas placed above their tombs, during this period, small chapels were added. These chapels contained depictions of the deceased seated in front of a table, and lists of provisions were provided. This practice of providing for the dead became standard for the rest of ancient Egyptian history. One major break with the past was the abandonment of the ancient burial ground of former dynasties at Abydos in favor of closer royal mortuary complexes at Memphis. As noted before, the Old Kingdom is the period of pyramid construction, including massive monumental building practices to Egyptian history, though the practice of pyramid construction began to wane as early as 6th dynasty. King Djoser, during the 3rd dynasty, was the first to have a pyramid created, leaving the standard of mud brick tombs in favor of more permanent stone. This pyramid was built by the now infamous Imhotep, an individual who was later deified and ultimately became the antagonist in the early 20th century movie The Mummy, along with its later 20th century reboot. This stepped pyramid, dating to around 2680 BC, was soon followed in the 4th dynasty by the Great Pyramids of Giza, one of which was the largest pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and belonged to Khufu. This pyramid was 146 meters tall and measured 230 meters by 230 meters at the base, and it's estimated to contain over 2 million stone blocks, each weighing around 2 3/4 tons. Along with the Pyramid of his Son, the entire mortuary complex includes lesser pyramids, a causeway, a valley temple, and a pyramid temple, all laid out on an east-west axis. This mortuary complex also included housing for the thousands of paid Egyptians who had built the complex, rather than the often assumed slave labor. Along with the dormitories were kitchens for the people to prepare food, workshops to manage their tools, kilns, and a whole lot more. Now, experimenting with architectural techniques continued into the 5th dynasty, the final king of which was the first to include spells on the walls of his interior chamber. These spells are the best preserved of the Old Kingdom sources, and they later became canonical, all of one of which being copied in the Middle Kingdom. It's important to note that the riches of these sacred sites had been robbed out long ago, which may have led to the eventual dismissal of the projects. The answer as to why pyramids were considered necessary may fall into the beliefs concerning these Old Kingdom rulers, namely their relation to the gods. Egyptian kings during the Old Kingdom were considered to be begotten by the sun god Ra, and as such, they kept order, acted as a mediator between the people and the gods, and executed the will of the gods. This association of Ra to the kings began as early as the 3rd dynasty, Imhotep, mentioned before, receiving the title of Greatest of Seers, a title continued through the Old Kingdom onwards and held by the high priest of Ra. Egyptians also began to put religious and wisdom writings to text in the Old Kingdom, though most early writings date to the 6th dynasty and later. Old Kingdom kings also provided the funding for the construction of royal chapels at local temples throughout the kingdom, which were important economic centers. Thus, the king intervened in the affairs of these temples and controlled their economic activities. In combination with the pyramid building projects, of which the entire kingdom participated in some fashion, bureaucratic organization was extremely complex, particularly as the adult men conscripted to the building of these monumental structures worked 3-month stints away from their home duties, whose families also need to be cared for. This bureaucracy partially consisted of estates scattered across the kingdom. These included a network of royal warehouses and production centers, as well as agricultural storage. Now, that said, during the Old Kingdom, there is no evidence of individual registration for tax purposes. Only estates and towns were ordered to pay taxes, and therefore the collection of those taxes within these precincts were left up to the estates and towns. Of the many innovations of the Old Kingdom, perhaps the establishment of a type of police force is the one most readily in continued use today. The concept of such appears to date back to the 4th dynasty, where personal security officials were known as judges and police. From the 5th dynasty, a relief from a tomb shows one of these officers seizing a thief in the local marketplace. Although the elaborate building projects of Egyptian kings in the Old Kingdom may give the illusion of stability, there was an essence of power struggle at several points throughout, including the contestation of successors and ideologically different groups taking power. The decline in state control appears to have begun as early as the 5th dynasty, when the established bureaucracy, which was so important, underwent major changes. By the 6th dynasty, bureaucrats themselves appear to have had their own interest in mind and began to gain control over the state and how it developed. Interestingly, during the last 2 dynasties of the Old Kingdom, pyramid sizes declined and investments were made in other areas, specifically in decorating temples. These decorations included reliefs of the king victorious over foreign enemies, associating with the gods, and receiving gifts from long lines of gift bearers. By the time of the reign of the first king of the 6th dynasty, Teti, local officials were building mortuary complexes much more elaborate than the kings. Now, according to a 3rd century BC Egyptian historian, Teti, the king, was assassinated by his own guards. And though the veracity of this is uncertain, he would be the very first king of Egypt to receive such a punishment. When discovered, his tomb shows evidence that his burial was finished in haste. The sarcophagus still resting on the wooden beams intended to be used to install it. And the names of a number of Teti's officials had their names erased from history by scratching out the chiseled stone that contained them. The instability of Teti's reign is further evidenced by one of his royal names, he who pacifies the 2 lands. One theory as to the weakening of the Egyptian kingdom at this time mirrors the end of the early Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, specifically the drying phase throughout the Akkadian Empire. These climatic changes occurred all over the northern hemisphere and impacted not only Mesopotamia and Egypt, but other civilizations, including those in Greece and the Indus Valley. Drying necessarily means drought, and drought very often turns hungry citizens against those who keep the granaries. Thus, these climatic changes played a major role in the demise of the Old Kingdom. As the climate changed and as the Egyptian bureaucracy attempted to adapt, so a religious change occurred as well. The earliest sources that refer to the god Osiris date to the 4th or 5th dynasty, found in private tombs. At the end of the 5th dynasty, Osiris had become favored to the point that the last 2 kings of the dynasty, they didn't even build temples to the sun god Ra. And the funerary chamber of the last king, Unas, predominantly contained Osirian religious inscriptions. Unfortunately, attempts to revive the kingdom failed on the part of the kings. As drought continued, the palace did not respond, leaving local officials to care for their own regions without the needed resources and without the desire to help the rest of the kingdom. Ultimately, the 6th dynasty ended, and Egypt fell into a major period of instability known today as the First Intermediate Period. Now, that's somewhat of a sad note to end on, but thus is history. The history of humanity is filled with these ups and downs, and the early Bronze Age ended with famine in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. I hope you're enjoying these lectures. As always, if you need anything from me, please feel free to reach out.